I'd like to welcome Chris Hedges, a Pulitzer-Prize winning journalist, activist, and current columnist at Truthdig.com to the Soapbox. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
So, let's see. I'm not sure quite where to start. There's a lot of sort of darkness and misery and sadness going on around the world that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. Perhaps we should start in Ferguson with some of the police actions that have been taken recently and the increasingly militaristic approach of the police in the face of what had at least initially begun as a peaceful protest in response to the killing of Michael Brown, an unarmed teenager. This is sort of a big question, but you speak often about in the concept of inverted totalitarianism in America, which is a concept that Sheldon Wolin put forward in his book, Democracy Incorporated. And I'm wondering if you could maybe give a quick synopsis for our listeners of what that is, and then if what we're seeing in Ferguson, if that isn't indicative of a transition or what might look like, or what the transition from an inverted totalitarianism to a traditional totalitarianism in this country might end up looking like.
Well, inverted totalitarianism is a term coined by Sheldon Wolin, who is our greatest living political philosopher, as any student of political theory knows. His masterpiece, Politics and Vision, 1960. And it, in essence, argues that we have undergone a corporate coup. That's a term used by John Ralston Saul, another writer I like very much. But it says that, all of the facade of American democracy remains in place. The forces in power purport to pay fealty to the Constitution, electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism, but internally these corporate forces have seized all of the levers of power as to render the citizen impotent. And I think that's exactly right. That's what's happened. The consent of the governed has become a kind of cruel joke, and we have seen everything from declining and stagnant wages, the destruction of labor unions, the seizure of the forms of communication, especially electronic forms of communication, by roughly a half dozen corporations: Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel, which lock out any serious critique of power. The only national show, which is funded through a foundation, not by PBS, that deals seriously with power outside of Democracy Now! With Amy, is Moyers. We don't examine systems of power at all. In a system of inverted totalitarianism, it differs from classical totalitarianism in that it doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. And that's where we are. It's important to remember that this is global, that the neo-feudalism, the destruction of the middle class, the impoverishment of the working class, which has essentially become the working poor, is global. These forces are supranational. They have no loyalty to any one nation state. Now, what happened in Ferguson is, I think, probably more astutely expressed by Hannah Arendt in Origins of Totalitarianism when she writes about the stateless in Europe. And she herself had fled to France, no official documents, and is at the mercy of what she calls omnipotent police forces. If you look at marginal communities, especially urban marginal communities for people of color, the police forces have been empowered through law to do whatever they want to whomever they want. They can kick down doors. They can randomly stop people. 97% of people in these communities who are picked up on charges plea out because the judicial system just doesn't work. And I teach in a prison, and I can tell you that my students who have the longest terms are usually the ones who refuse to plea out. For example, I have a student who was a member of the U.S. Army boxing team. He left the Army. He was about to go professional. He was picked up for a crime he says he did not commit, and I believe he probably didn't. They offered him 16 months on a plea, and he refused. He said, I'm about to go pro. I can't spend 16 months sitting in the cell, and I didn't commit the crime. He went to court. They gave him 30 years. And they will stack you with these absurd charges and draconian sentences, in essence, to force you to plea out. So there's no sort of actual, in reality, although we describe our judiciary as giving people a chance for due process doesn't exist if you're poor and if you're of color. And Hannah Arendt says that this same kind of stripping away of civil liberties was what took place in countries like France towards the stateless, those people who weren't French, they weren't German anymore because they'd fled Nazi Germany and had their documents taken from them. And she said that's always a stepping stone in totalitarian societies, because once you create a mechanism for what she calls omnipotent policing, whereby the police can do whatever they want, and in essence, you're allowing your police force to serve as judge, jury, and executioner, which is, of course, what happened in Ferguson, as it happens in every impoverished inner-city area in this country. We just saw it in New York with somebody strangled to death by the cops. Then, in a moment of crisis, you already have a mechanism in place by which this omnipotent police force can be used against a restive citizenry. And I think she's right. I think that's the danger, that once these omnipotent police forcing units are allowed to strip a segment of the society of their most basic rights, when the power elite feels threatened, they already have the mechanism by which they can strip the rights of the rest of the country. Remember, legally, we have just seen, and Barack Obama's assault on civil liberties has been far more egregious than that under George W. Bush. Everything from the, I would argue, misinterpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act, which the president or the executive branch believes gives them the right to assassinate American citizens, including 16-year-old kids. This is the son of Anwar al-Awlaki. The FISA Amendment Act, which is essentially legalized wholesale surveillance of every single American citizen. All of our electronic communications are captured and stored in perpetuity by the government and supercomputers in places like Utah. The Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is bipartisan, sponsored by Levin and McCain, which overturns 150 or 170 years of domestic law that had prohibited the military from carrying out policing on American streets. And now, in essence, Section 1021 allows the military to carry out extraordinary rendition on American soil of American citizens, strip them of due process, and hold them in military facilities, including in our black sites overseas, in perpetuity, indefinitely. And I, as you know, when Obama signed that into law, which he did on New Year's Eve, or 2011, 2012, that night, January 31st, hoping nobody would notice, I sued him in federal court in the Southern District Court of New York, and we won. I was joined in that suit by other co-plaintiffs, Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, Alex O'Brien, others. And that Obama administration was interesting how they reacted, because that we knew they'd appeal, but they didn't just appeal. They actually sent not only the federal attorneys, but the Pentagon attorneys to Judge Forrest's chambers on the day she issued the ruling, and demanded that the law be put into effect, that she lift her temporary injunction, the law be put back into effect, until the appellate court could rule, the second highest court, the Second Circuit. And Judge Forrest, to her credit, refused. So then that was a Friday, 9 a.m. Monday morning, they showed up at the appellate court and demanded the same thing, and the appellate court temporarily lifted the injunction, put it back into effect, the law back into effect. Now, you know, the lawyers and I had to ask why. Why? We knew they'd appeal, but why were they so aggressive? And I think the only thing that we could determine was that they're already using the law. And because if they're holding a U.S. citizen, probably a U.S. dual nationality from Pakistan or somewhere in one of our black sites in Bagram or something, and that injunction was allowed to stand, they would be found in contempt of court. What happened was that when the Obama administration appealed and took it to the appellate court, it took the appellate court a very long time to rule, and the reason was because they were waiting to see how the Supreme Court would rule on another case in which I was a plaintiff challenging the wholesale surveillance. This was Amnesty International versus Clapper. And the government lawyers in that case, this was before the Snowden revelations, actually got up in court and said that I and the other plaintiffs had no standing. We had no credibility to bring the case because if the government was in fact carrying out surveillance of us, we would be told. I mean, it was absurd. And that the charge that we were actually having our correspondence and phone records and everything monitored and taken was, in the words of the government lawyer, speculation, which we now know to be a lie. And the Supreme Court agreed and threw the case out. And then the appellate court, rather than rule on whether the military can be used because it is unconstitutional, they said, well, look, the case was called Hedges versus Obama. Hedges has no standing in the Clapper versus Amnesty International. Therefore, he has no standing in Hedges versus Obama, so the case was thrown out. Now, this is a classic way that the courts, which have become wholly owned subsidiaries of the corporate state, have been used to essentially subvert our most basic constitutional rights, so that on the books they all remain, but in fact they don't exist anymore. And that is, I think, part of what Poulin would describe as inverted totalitarianism, that the facade of these constitutional rights appears to be in place, but the reality, in essence, through judicial fiat, is such that those rights have been stripped from us. And that's exceedingly dangerous. If you go back and look at the early years of any totalitarian regime, whether it's Stalinist Russia or whether it's Nazi Germany, and Sebastian Hoffner did a very good job of explaining all this in his really great book, Define Hitler. The first thing they do is subvert the legal system. They create a legal mechanism, in essence, to justify totalitarianism. And I think that mechanism is already in place, coupled with these omnipotent police-forcing entities, which, by the way, are being saturated with military-grade equipment, not just Kevlar-plated pieces of body armor, but armored personnel carriers and assault helicopters, and they're carrying long-barreled weapons, M16s, and so that if you have a night raid in Oakland on a drug suspect, or a nonviolent drug suspect, where they're kicking in the door and bursting in with M16s, and have a command center outside and maybe a helicopter up in the air with a searchlight, it doesn't look any different from a night raid in Fallujah. And if you look at those who have written about the disease of empire, going all the way back to Thucydides, what happens is that the mechanisms of control, empires always rot from the inside out. And, all you have to do is get in a car and drive across this country to see the physical decay that is now part of the United States, or just, drive up to the old mill towns where I'm from in Maine. And you understand that eventually what happens is that the forms of control on the outer edges of empire are brought back into empire by despotic power centers to try and maintain control of a restive population by violence. So, we're seeing law enforcement agencies get drones. We're seeing the militarization of police. We're seeing the creation through a legal system of the omnipotent police forces who can do anything they want to anyone they want in these communities. And we are following the traditional pattern by which empires decay into despotism. And Thucydides said that, in Athens' expanding empire, this is quoting Thucydides, the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself, which crushed Athenian democracy. And, historical examples are always subject to variance. I mean, there was slavery in Athens, there isn't. But I think we, not to understand history and how systems of power work makes you more easily prey to those systems.
Ralph Nader was recently on the Soapbox, and as you likely know, his recent book, Unstoppable, the emerging alliance, left-right alliance that can, rescue us. I'm mingling the subtitle. I apologize to him, but as you know, he seems to be a firm believer in American democracy. And speaking with him, he seems to genuinely believe that through the right sort of mass movement, citizens can impact legislation and hold legislators accountable. And you often talk about how the mechanisms of power have abandoned the citizenry. And I'm wondering if you disagree with Mr. Nader about the ability for the citizenry to work within the existing system, the existing structure, to bring about a necessary change for the country.
Well, Ralph and I are quite close, and I was his speechwriter in 2008. I don't disagree with Ralph on very much. I did ask him after he wrote, only the super rich can save us, when in a period of human history and oligarchy ever stepped in to save anyone. I think Ralph understands the decay within the system, but he believes that it is possible still to exert pressure within that system to make it reform. I think Ralph does believe that we have to organize and build mass movements, as I do. I don't think the system is reformable at this point. I think power has been transferred effectively to a class of speculators on Wall Street who are busily going about not only amassing tremendous sums of money for themselves, but ensuring that there will be another financial collapse because they're playing all the same games that they were playing before. Speculation is essentially a form of gambling. Speculators in the 17th century in Europe were hung. It was a capital offense. And here they write all of our legislation, and they run the government. And you can see it with Obama, who has been utterly obsequious since he came into office to corporate power. And until we break the back of corporate power, we are not going to have anything approaching a democracy. And that's not going to be done by getting a bunch of elected officials who are all, in essence, working for corporate power to pass campaign finance. They're just not going to do it. It's not in their interest. These people make tremendous sums of money. The moment Obama leaves the White House, like the Clintons, he will become a multimillionaire. So I think that, in that sense, I think the system's too far gone. I think that we have to create mechanisms by which that system is destroyed. And, quite frankly, if we don't do it soon, we're finished because of climate change. We're already far past the tipping point. And these fossil fuel industries are going to kill us in the name of short-term profit. They look at the melting of 40% of the summer Arctic ice as a business opportunity to drop $500 million drill bits down into the Arctic Sea. It's insane. It's, profiting off the death throes of the planet. And these are the people who have power. These are the people who are in charge. And these are the people who are squandering not only our well-being, but finally the well-being of our children and all future generations. And they have a kind of frightening pathology to the way that they look at the world. In essence, every human beings are commodities. The natural world is a commodity. That because there are now no external restraints, they will exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And that goes for us as well as for the ecosystem on which we depend for life. So, and we don't have any time left. We don't have time to play any games. So either we rise up and break these mechanisms of self-destruction, or we really begin to seriously flirt with our virtual enslavement or serfdom to these forces. And I don't have to tell you what that's like. My relatives all come from inland Maine, and the poverty is reached appalling levels.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm a little less hopeful that the system is reformable.
So, do you view, let's say, participating in elections, voting, do you view that as sort of contributing to this this fallacy that exists in this country, that we can have an impact through the existing structures, and so conversely, would you recommend not voting, or do you still recommend that people vote, or do you not even wade into those waters?
Well, I supported Nader, from 2000 to 2008, and then I supported the Green Party after that. I recommend doing everything within your power to throw a wrench into the system.
Mm-hmm.
If you believe that voting for Hillary Clinton, who looks like our next candidate, will somehow significantly improve the situation rather than voting for Jeb Bush, then I would say you're deeply self-deluded. There has been almost a complete continuity on every major structural issue, from militarism to the erosion of civil liberties to the inability to contain the criminality of Wall Street, from Bush to Obama. There you have kind of social issues, which I'm very sympathetic to, in terms of abortion, or women's right to control their own body, or GBLT rights. I mean, but in essence, what counts and what will determine our future, there's no daylight between the Republicans and the Democrats. It's rather what Freud called the narcissism of minor difference, and we hold elections really, they aren't really based on issues anyway. They revolve around a fictitious personal narrative created by public relations firms, and public relations is probably the most evil industry in the United States outside of the arms industry, who, and then we debate, these personal narratives. It's kind of infantile. So I'm all for third parties. I'm all for, but I'm not naive enough. I mean, when you're spending $2.5 billion on elections, Nader at his height only raised $5 million. So any third party is just crippled, but I'm damned if I'm ever going to vote for the Democrats or the Republicans. But it's a kind of protest vote. I'm not, but I think it's good. I mean, I think that, I wish we could mount, we had $15-20 million to mount a serious third-party insurgency just to get these issues heard, not in any naive belief that they would be elected, and to register our deep disgust at the political theater that and the facade of democracy that that we're sort of supposed to believe in.
So you talk about the necessity of sort of breaking the existing structures that are serving sort of the corporate wealthy elites and not really doing anything to help citizens around the world or protect the environment. You've also spoken quite eloquently and written quite eloquently about nonviolence, and I'm wondering, do you feel that violence in the resistance to sort of the corporate state would ever be justified, or would you stick strictly to a nonviolent approach?
Well, I'm not a pacifist. I mean, I was in Sarajevo during the war when we were being hit with 2,000 Serb shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. So I understood, like every Bosnian in the city that was completely surrounded, that if the Serbs broke through the trench lines, we actually had trenches around the city, a third of us would be killed and the rest of us would be driven into refugee or displacement camps. Now, that wasn't hypothetical, because that's what the Serbs did in Vukovar. It's what they did in the Drina Valley. We had lots of examples of what would happen. So you didn't sit around being stonked by 155 howitzers and 90 millimeter tank rounds and have discussions about nonviolence. You would have been laughed out of the basement you were huddled in. So there are moments when there are forces that seek your annihilation, and you have every right to defend yourself, and which, by the way, with under Article 51 in the UN Charter, the Palestinians in Gaza have every right to use violence to defend themselves from Israeli attacks. So I'm not any kind of a purist in terms of violence. I don't like violence. I know it well as a war correspondent for 20 years. I know the poison that it is, even when used in a supposedly justifiable cause. It's just not true. Revolutions are not violent events. Violence, anarchist violence can be part of revolutions, but no revolution succeeds until the security forces and the military are no longer willing to defend a discredited power elite. That was true in the revolutions I covered in Eastern Europe. That was true in 1917, when the Cossacks were called out to Petrograd and refused to fire on the crowd, and in fact started fraternizing with the crowd, and the Tsars put on a railway car to come back to Petrograd and doesn't even make it. He abdicates in his railway carriage before he gets there. That was true in East Germany. Erich Honecker, the 19 years he'd been in power, the communist dictator, sends down elite paratroop division to Leipzig, where the uprising was taking place. 70,000 people were supposed to march, and had ordered them to fire on the crowd. They refused to do it. Honecker's out of power in another week. So this was true with the Shah in Iran when the military decided. So, in fact, revolutions, this was also true in the French Revolution, revolutions succeed when the foot soldiers of the elite, who are tasked with imposing discipline and using violence to restrain a rebellion, refuse to do so. And so the most powerful weapon we have is the truth, which is explaining the corruption and the decay of those forces, so that police units and others will walk away from defending them. Now, remember, in New York City, most of these cops moonlight as private security guards for big companies like Goldman Sachs. They make $37 an hour. And they stand in the hallways and they watch these guys go by in their $8,000 suits and their limos, and they know, they see it. So I think that's number one. Number two, as a war correspondent, I know the forces that can be deployed against us. I mean, we have 30 or 60,000, I can't remember, special forces. These guys are just death squads. I mean, that's, in essence, a death squad went and killed Osama bin Laden, like they've killed lots of other people around the Middle East. And we have no hope of, I mean, all these people who think they have guns in their houses, and, I mean, I guarantee you, having seen it in Bosnia and other places, that if a SWAT team surrounds your house, you are not going to run out with your 38 or 2020 Winchester and take them on. So it just, violence isn't going to work. It's just, and history has proven that. We have to, I mean, part of my antagonism toward black bloc anarchists is that, I mean, they can do what they want, but they can't join nonviolent, massive movements because they're used by the state to frighten people away very effectively, and half of them are probably cops anyway. We have to build the kinds of numbers that I saw, for instance, in Prague, where 500,000 people take over the center of the city. That's what we have to do.
Do you have a few more minutes, Chris? Is that okay? One more question, maybe?
Sure.
So I'm wondering if you have any sense at all of what it is we need to do, what it is we can do to begin, if it hasn't already begun, to form these necessary mass movements that can begin to sort of move the needle a little bit more towards the side of justice and fairness.
Well, the movements are there. That's not a problem. There are all sorts of groups from, veterans for Peace, they're all out there. Nobody shows up to the events. I show up to them. But that's also how it works. So you have, for instance, in East Germany, you had these Lutheran clergy holding weekly candlelit vigils. At first, 20 people showed up, or it's more, you keep doing that kind of resistance so people know where to go. That also happened in Czechoslovakia. You had Václav Havel. He founds Charter 77 in 1977. He's a non-person in the Czechoslovakian communist state. His plays aren't published. He's never heard. He's in and out of jail. It's a small group of dissidents, 77 dissidents. But by 1989, everybody knew who had the moral authority to stand up in the Velvet Revolution, and that was Havel, I used to see him every night in the Magic Lantern Theater in Prague during the Revolution. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't even a very good speaker. And I think that the issue of where to go, people will as long as groups that hold fast to that moral imperative continue to resist, people will find them. What is it that triggers it? Well, that you never know. That's a kind of mysterious force. What is it that finally pushes people over the edge? It's often something benign. Alexander Berkman calls it, revolutions. He says he calls it in an essay called The Invisible Revolution. You never actually see the discrediting of the ideas and the institutions. Everything appears on the surface to be the way it always was, and then suddenly there's collapse, which is, of course, what I saw in East Germany. So here you have the Stasi state, this monolithic structure, the most sophisticated security and surveillance state in human history until our own, and everything appears unassailable. And then when it appears to collapse almost instantly. Because it's been discredited. People no longer believe in it, including the people within the system itself. So it's about transmitting these ideas, transmitting this truth, getting people to hear it, and because there's no check on the ruling elite, the only word they understand is more, they're not going to stop. They're going to continue to cut unemployment benefits, slash welfare. They've done nothing to address the chronic unemployment and underemployment, which is at real levels. They hide the figures. That's the other thing. Even the Los Angeles Times says that our real unemployment rate is probably 17%, but that doesn't count all the people who work but are below the poverty line, the working poor. And the average worker at Walmart works about 28 hours a week, and they're below the poverty level, which is why the Walton family at their stores will give them applications for food stamps because they qualify. So we get to subsidize the Waltons who make $11,000 an hour, I think I once read. Because they will push and push and push and extract more and more and more, it's guaranteed that there will be a reaction. But when it will come, what will trigger it, we don't know. No one ever knows. You can sense the tinder is there, and I spent 2 years with Joe Sacco writing my book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, out of the very poorest pockets of the country, Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States, the coal fields of southern West Virginia, Pine Ridge, South Dakota, etc., to say, look, this is what unfettered, unregulated corporate capitalism will do. It's created what we call sacrifice zones, these places where they control the courts, they control the press, they control the policing, they control legislation, they control everything, and they're destroying the environment and thrusting these people into real economic misery and deprivation. And now you have to look at these sacrifice zones because this is going to be writ large across the entire country. So it's always the ruling elite that determines the configurations of revolt. And when there are two flashing red lights. One is what Bakunin called déclassé intellectuals. These are when you get the sons and daughters of the middle class, which was the Occupy movement, who find they no longer have a place in the society. And, of course, they're burdened by tremendous debt from college debt. That's key. And when the elite starts to consume their own, and you saw it with at the end of the French monarchy when Louis XVI would revoke the patents. He would sell patents to the nobility, and then he would just take them back and resell them. You see it on Wall Street when they're defrauding their own shareholders and their small investors, people who put money into 401ks. That's a very dangerous moment, and we're there. But when it comes, how long it will take, what it will look like, what it will be called, having covered uprisings and revolutions around the world, no one knows. Even the people who are purportedly working towards it.
Well, Chris Hedges, I would like to thank you very much for your time today, and also thank you for all of the good work that you're doing out there. It's heartening to know that your voice is out there, so thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for doing the interview.
My pleasure. Have a good day.
Thanks.